So today we're going to talk about one of the biggest topics that we get asked questions on all the time in the Bike Fit studio, and that is crank length. My name's Dan and I'm a bike fitter and the owner of UK Bike Fit, and we're going to talk to you today about the differences in crank length and hopefully give you a bit of insight on what sort of crank length you should be riding. So this is our sizing jig that we predominantly use to do pre-purchase sizing fits with people who either haven't had a bike fit before or are looking to buy a new bike. But it's also got adjustable components on it that we can test the effect of. So we can have a look at different stem lengths, we can have a look at different bar widths and bar reaches. But we're going to use it today because we have a set of adjustable cranks on here. So we're going to have a look at what effect a different crank length might have on your body as you ride. So we're going to have a look at the hip angle, we're going to have a look at the pelvic stability, we're going to have a look at what the feet do with a different crank length. We're going to test right up to a 185mm crank length and then right down to a 155mm crank length. So you'll be able to see the effects of riding a different crank length, and that will give us an idea around what sort of crank length you should be riding. So we're going to start by looking at a 185mm crank length, which is obviously to the extreme. The stock crank lengths that come with bikes are normally relatively long compared to what most people optimally need, but by testing this at an exaggerated length, we're hopefully going to show why the old way of thinking that the longer the crank, the longer the lever, the more torque and the more power sort of theory is probably not as beneficial as it once was. So we've set this crank length to 185mm, and we've got Jen, our other physio and bike fitter, riding the bike. Jen normally rides 165mm cranks, so it'll be interesting to see initially how she feels on the bike, and we'll get those first impressions, and then we're going to have a look at exactly how Jen's moving and why 185mm might not be the best crank length for her. So straight away we can see that Jen's pedal stroke looks really slow and laboured and really hard work, especially to get over the top of the pedal stroke. So how does that feel to ride at the moment?
It feels like it's really hard work to get going, and like at the top and at the bottom of the pedal stroke there's just nothing going on. It's like I'm not putting any power down, but at the same time it's hard work to like get my leg round, and I also feel like my hips are just rolling around in the saddle loads more than they normally would.
Yeah, so you can see like Jen's hips rocking up and down or tilting up and down as you get over the top of the pedal stroke. And like we know, like Jen's pretty flexible. Like you do a lot of strength stuff, core stuff, flexibility work. So, you know, your flexibility is definitely better than average, and even you are struggling to like get around that full pedal stroke without any excess movement at the hips. So if you did have a bit of tightness or weak core, or you were less strong, that would become much more exaggerated in someone else as well. So we've obviously gone for 185mm, which is a very extreme crank length, but most stock bikes will probably come with between 175 and 170mm cranks, which still for most people is a much bigger range, or a longer range than they would optimally need for their bike fit. This is especially true when we're talking about women's bikes and bikes for smaller people. So Jen, like, what's your experience of women's bikes and what sort of crank length they come with and how that feels to ride?
Yeah, so like you said, most stock bikes come with 170 to 175, and even if you're looking at like the smaller range of bikes, like most small bikes that I would get would come with 170 cranks, which as women with generally shorter legs than men, we would need a shorter crank length than that. So I've only seen live bikes coming with, which are made specifically for women, coming with shorter than 170mm cranks. And there's also the other issue of like women needing narrow handlebars, which is generally made differently to men. We're not just small men, so we need bikes that fit our geometry.
So we've now shortened the cranks on the sizing jig to 155mm, so 3 centimeters shorter than we were previously riding. Now, to keep the saddle height effectively the same, I've now got to raise the saddle height that 3 centimeter difference to make sure that the bottom of the pedal stroke, as it's come up with a shorter crank, is relative to the top of the pedal stroke at the same distance. So we're going to watch Jen pedaling now and see what the differences are between 185mm and 155mm. Again, a big jump, but just to illustrate the differences in body position. Straight away, you can see that Jen's hips and pelvis is a lot more stable when she's pedaling. Going over the top of the pedal stroke looks a lot less effort. She's very quickly into the downstroke rather than having a pause at the top of the pedal stroke where she's sort of laboring to get into that down phase. And cadence is increased and everything looks a lot smoother in general. How's that feeling?
Yeah, it just feels a lot more efficient, and like I'm not having to put as much effort in, but also like I'm not losing anything. And like the whole sort of circle action has got some power going through it.
Yeah, sure. So that's one of the big downsides of a really long crank, is that as you're going over the top of the pedal stroke, it actually takes quite a lot of that circle to occur before you can actually start putting power into the pedal again. That last top of the pedal stroke is very dead, and that's what you'd call typically a dead spot at the top and the bottom of the pedal stroke, where the foot or the leg isn't able to produce power into the bike. It's just getting carried over the top of the pedal stroke. Whereas now, as soon as Jen's foot comes over the top of the pedal stroke, her hip and knee are in a really good position to produce power. And that's really what we want, to minimize those dead spots and maximize efficiency. So we've shown the differences in body position with a longer crank and a shorter crank, and now we're going to look at why those differences in body position are important and how they generate power and efficiency through your pedal stroke. Traditionally, the longer crank was thought to have a longer lever, which then would generate more torque through the pedal stroke, and more torque equaled more power. But more recently, that myth has been dispelled, and the reason for that is that a pedal stroke is not just in one position where the foot is at the front of the pedal stroke. We obviously pedal in a circle, and that torque changes as you pedal through the circle, and there are other benefits to having a different body position through different parts of that circle. One of those benefits is to keep the muscles in a more mid-range state rather than being fully contracted or fully lengthened, and we're going to show that now with a power curve and how power is affected by muscle length. So I'm going to show off my artistic capabilities now by drawing a power muscle length relationship curve. So we've got muscle length along the bottom, and we're going to have power up the side. And let's have a long muscle length and a short muscle length on this axis. So basically, when the muscle is short, in a shortened position, it's not very powerful. So it's quite weak in that position. And then as we get longer into the muscle belly or extend that muscle out, we get much more power. And then as we start to come more into a long position with the muscle, the power starts to drop off and the muscle becomes weak again. It can't access as much power. So when we have a crank length that is really long in relation to our body type and geometry, the muscles spend a lot more time working in this sort of range. So they'll work when the muscle's really long, and they'll work when the muscles are in a shortened position. And the muscles we're talking about really are hip flexors, glutes, hamstrings, and quads. So the overall range of power when the crank is very long is probably being produced in this sort of box here. So we're still accessing those higher powers, but in relation to the total pedal stroke, it's a much shorter part of that pedal stroke, versus when we have a shorter crank length and we cut out a lot of this weak muscle positions that we don't have to use, then the overall pedal stroke is used or using a much bigger percentage of time when the muscles are able to produce more power. So although we're cutting out part of the pedal stroke and cutting out some positions that the muscles can't be used in, those positions are relatively very weak to what we can access up here. So the benefits of having a shorter crank length is not only positional, where we're getting more stability and less movement of the hips and the pelvis when we're coming over the top of the pedal stroke, but in terms of power output, we're actually only using the more strong part of the muscle or the strong position of the muscle, rather than wasting energy trying to work down here when the muscles are either really long or really short. after all of that, the big question is, how do you know whether you're riding a crank length that's too long for you? And ultimately, there's a lot of feeling involved. So next time you're on the bike, just have a think around what your pelvis is doing, what your hips are doing. Do you feel like your pelvis is rocking from side to side and lifting up off the saddle at each time your hip or knee comes over the top of that pedal stroke? And see if you can feel that instability is going on. The other thing that you might feel with a crank that's too long is a lot of dead spot in your power output. So can you feel that over the top of the pedal stroke, your foot's actually having to drop quite a long way down the front of the pedal stroke before you can actually produce any meaningful power? And the same at the bottom. Does the power then stop before you've actually finished that total pedal stroke, so that you're not really creating power through the whole of the pedal stroke? You're actually missing a large portion of your movement. And a good way to describe that, or think about that at home in terms of the muscle length versus the power, is think about your bicep. So with a straight arm and the biceps at its longest position, the muscle itself is actually really weak. It's very hard to hold that power or that force in that position. And likewise, when the biceps very short and contracted, it's really hard to hold it in that position against some force. But the peak force of the bicep is when it's in this mid-range. So in the middle of the muscle length, the bicep can produce a lot more force and strength and power. And it's exactly the same for every other muscle in your body, including glutes, hamstrings, quads, all of those big driver muscles of the pedal stroke. So if you're noticing any of those sorts of feelings of instability or lack of power through the top and the bottom of the pedal stroke, it might be worth trying to change to a shorter crank and just see what that sort of feeling is. And obviously, if you do want to come for a fit or a sizing and use our sizing jig to explore different crank lengths, then I would definitely say that's the best option.